history is seldom comfortable. It's messy, unexpected, and often disturbingly intimate. Today, we're diving into the most bizarre sexual practices of the Middle Ages, from communal rituals to scandalous medical beliefs. Strap in. This isn't your grandma's history lesson. Asterisk. In the dimly lit corners of medieval Europe, when the chill of the evening crept beneath the thatched rooftops and firelight danced across rough wooden walls, there existed a peculiar tradition, one both innocent and oddly intimate, that quietly thrived among the colder, more conservative communities. It was called bundling. To the untrained ear, the term may suggest something entirely different. But in truth, bundling was a curious social custom designed to walk the razor-thin line between virtue and desire, between courtship and restraint. Imagine a candle guttering in the corner of a small peasant home. The hearth offers its last warmth for the night, and the heavy quilted covers on the narrow wooden bed are pulled high. Inside that lie two figures, young, uncertain, and maybe a little flushed from both the cold and the sheer awkwardness of the moment. They are not yet married. They are not yet lovers. But they are something suspended between those two fragile stations. The boy, perhaps a farmer's son, his hands calloused from plowing fields and lifting sacks of barley, lies beside a girl, the baker's daughter perhaps, her face still glowing from hours near a stone oven, flour clinging to the tips of her fingers, and between them, a board or a sewn sheet. Or perhaps nothing but layers upon layers of stitched cloth. A bundling bag. A token of trust and a barrier of propriety. The purpose of bundling was, in theory, simple. To allow a courting couple to spend the night together, talking, bonding, warming each other in the literal sense, but without giving in to the full temptation of the flesh. It was a compromise between the thrill of companionship and the constraints of a moral code that loomed large over every decision, every movement, every shared glance. For in many parts of medieval society, a couple was not always free to meet in private. Chaperones were expected. Supervision was enforced. But bundling, curiously enough, was a loophole. It was often accepted, even encouraged, as a way to test compatibility, emotional and spiritual, if not physical. You see, in a world where marriage was less about love and more about survival, merging families and securing future laborers for the fields, people clung to what little romance they could find. Bundling became a rare oasis of emotional exploration. In the quiet of the night, voices softened by the hush of straw and stone, young people whispered to one another in that sacred space between sleep and wakefulness. They spoke of dreams, of fears, of the future. The creak of the bed frame and the ticking of the fire, the only soundtrack to their tentative connection. In regions like Wales, Ireland, and the Dutch-influenced parts of early America, this practice took root with cultural variations. Sometimes, bundling was done with both parties fully clothed, wrapped tightly in layers to prevent any wandering touches. In other cases, the girl's parents would monitor the situation closely, even entering the room to ensure that boundaries were kept. There are accounts of mothers sewing their daughters into thick linen sacks, knotting them at the neck, just in case temptation took a sudden hold. It sounds absurd to modern ears, but to those families, it was serious business. This was not a game. This was a sacred negotiation between hope and honor. But of course, not every bundled bed remained so virtuous. There were stories whisperers traded at markets and over fences of couples who untied the knots, who slipped beneath barriers, who let warmth and curiosity take them further than they were meant to go. And when that happened, consequences followed. Pregnancies out of wedlock were not just a scandal, they were a sentence. A girl's reputation might be shattered, her prospects narrowed to shame or secrecy. A boy could be forced into an early, unwanted marriage or branded a seducer. Yet, still, bundling continued, because even with all its risks and vulnerabilities, it offered something that strict medieval life rarely did: a private space for connection. Picture, if you will, a storm outside. Wind curling through gaps in the wooden walls, snow tapping gently against the shuttered windows. Inside, the glow of a single tallow candle flickers, shadows long and slanted across the rough stone floor. In that moment, the couple in the bed lies still, the nervous energy of the day long past, their hands folded beneath the covers, inches apart, but worlds away. They speak softly, asking each other simple questions. What is your favorite color? What is your earliest memory? What do you fear most? And with each word, each hesitant smile, they bridge the divide that society has carved out for them. Bundling was not about desire in the way modern relationships are often framed. It wasn't about chemistry or passion or spark. It was about patience, stillness, learning the rhythms of another human soul before rushing into the demands of a lifelong commitment. There is a kind of old-fashioned beauty in that, a slowness that soothes the modern mind, overstimulated as it is by flashing lights and endless distractions. In bundling, there was no screen to stare at, no alarm to wake you too early. There was only the sound of another person breathing beside you, and the comfort of knowing that, even in your awkwardness, you are not alone. Many bundling stories didn't end in marriage, but some did. Some led to quiet unions and strong families, others to heartbreak or scandal. But all of them, every bundled night shared beneath quilts and boards and tightly stitched sacks, left an imprint on the history of intimacy. Are reminders of a time when courtship was cautious, when love had to sneak in under the rules, disguised as a conversation in the dark, when warmth was something you earned by being still and present, not something you scrolled through to find. And so the custom of bundling, strange as it may seem, holds a sleepy kind of poetry. In its soft hush and modest rituals, it offered comfort to generations who had very little control over their own futures. It gave young people the chance to see one another clearly, if only for a few hours in the safety of candlelight. In a world that expected so much silence, bundling allowed for voices to rise gentle, questioning, grave. It allowed for closeness without pressure, for honesty without the fear of immediate consequence. It gave room to breathe, to wonder, to listen. And in that quiet, a kind of love could grow, slowly and without spectacle, in the hush between midnight and morning. Asterisk, in the candlelit chambers of medieval feasting halls, behind the roaring fire. Pits and echoing laughter, there lingered something else quieter, more curious, almost secretive. It wafted through the air in curls of fragrant steam, rising from silvered platters and earthen bowls. A faint, sultry whisper beneath the clamor of goblets and gobbling mouths. It was the mystery of food and the belief, old as the soil itself, that what you ate could change how you felt, not just in the belly, but in the blood, the breath, the most hidden corners of the self. Among these beliefs, none was more tempting more secretly discussed, or more deeply believed in the power of a PHRODIS IACS. There, at the long oaken tables, sat lords and ladies, merchants and monks, their mouths filled with roasted meats and honeyed fruits. But beneath the display of festivity, there was always someone, perhaps a knight shifting in his seat, or a widow casting glances down the table, wondering whether the meal placed before them could awaken more than their appetite. For in the Middle Ages, food was never just nourishment. It was medicine, it was magic, and sometimes it was desire dressed in pastry. Aphrodisiac feasts were not always labeled as such. They often masqueraded as religious celebrations, harvest banquets, weddings. But within the dishes lay the intent hidden, unspoken yet understood. Oysters, slippery and glistening, were served not just for their taste, but for their shape, their suggestion. Truffles, unearthed from the roots of trees like forbidden treasure, were thought to spark the body's embers. Almonds and pine nuts, ground into sauces or stuffed into pies, carried with them a long-held belief in their power to stir the passions of those who consumed them. Even the humblest of ingredients could be transformed by belief. Leeks, onions, garlic, sharp, pungent, earthy, were said to inflame the senses. They were eaten with bread soaked in wine, or mashed into creamy pastes, left to warm by the hearth. Sometimes they were slipped into stews with tender cuts of meat, the juices soaking through, subtle and slow in their work. And those who consumed them might not speak aloud their hopes, but their cheeks flushed a little warmer, their laughter rolled a little longer. Their eyes lingered where they should not. There was cinnamon, too, rich and red as ancient silk, brought in small quantities from far-off lands by traders who traveled through deserts and oceans. It was not common. It was not cheap. But for those who could afford it, even a sprinkle on a sweetened apple was believed to stir desire. Nutmeg, clove, and anise, all used sparingly, almost reverently, added to wine and warm milk to make mulled drinks that tingled in the throat and stirred strange dreams in the minds of those who drank too deeply. And then there were the fabled foods, rare and strange, whispered about in the kitchens of nobles and the stalls of apothecaries. The heart of a sparrow, eaten raw. The tongue of a nightingale, dried and crushed. The powdered horn of a unicorn, which of course never truly existed, but which nonetheless was sold for small fortunes, its promises greater than gold. To the common man and woman, such ingredients were distant legends. But even among peasants, there were foods they believed could bring heat to cold limbs, closeness to lonely nights. A goose egg with nutmeg, a bowl of hot porridge stirred with honey and salt. Simple things, perhaps, but powerful in imagination. One must remember that in these times, knowledge of the body was both revered and riddled with error. The Church warned against lust, yet physicians spoke of humors and bodily balance, and advised certain foods to stoke or subdue the fires within. A young couple, newly married, might be advised to eat figs and drink goat's milk to ensure fertility. A man lacking in vigor might be served black bread with anchovy paste and a cup of boiled nettle tea. The boundaries between belief and biology were thin, often blurred, and yet the rituals were followed with care. Feasting in and of itself was considered an aphrodisiac. The act of sharing a table, of watching one another eat, fingers greasy, with roast goose, lips stained with wine, was a sensual experience. The way one reached for fruit, or licked the juice of a plum from their chin, could ignite something in the observer. In the great halls, there was music, flickering firelight, shadows dancing against stone walls. Everything was warmth and movement and closeness. And as the courses progressed from thick soups to boiled meats to custards spiced with saffron, so too did the air seem to grow heavier, more languid. Full bellies did not always lead to slumber. Sometimes they led to whispers behind tapestries, to slow steps down quiet corridors, to encounters lit only by the pale glow of a torch. But not all believed. Some scoffed at the notion. A monk, his robes heavy with the scent of incense, might write bitterly of such indulgences. A physician with dusty scrolls might warn against excess, claiming that too much food dulled the senses rather than sharpened them. Yet even they, in their solitude, might find their thoughts drifting when they remembered the taste of a certain meal, the scent of roasted figs, the softness of sugared almonds melting on the tongue. And then there were the cautionary tales of lovers whose passion, ignited by herbs and feasts, burned too brightly, too quickly, of secret affairs kindled by mulled wine and almond cakes, exposed under the scrutiny of morning. For while food could stoke desire, it could also betray. A misplaced dish, a shared cup, could leave behind rumors. The kitchen staff often knew more than they let on, and the line between remedy and scandal was thinner than a ribbon of honey poured over warm bread. Still, the practice endured. Through centuries and across borders, it transformed and traveled. What began in the feasting halls of medieval Europe would echo in Renaissance banquets and even into our own time, where chocolates and strawberries still carry with them the old remembered whispers of their ancestors. And though we may understand more now about biology and chemistry, something of the old belief lingers, something soft and deeply human. For in those flickering moments when food is shared, when eyes meet across a table, when laughter curls, like steam from a hot dish, there is a kind of magic that lives outside of time. It is the same magic that once filled the long halls of stone castles and timber-bird inns. It is the warmth of shared meals and secret glances, of spices stirred in hope and dishes served with trembling hands. It is the memory of aphrodisiac feasts, and all the longing they carried gently beneath their flavors dot. In the hushed and cloistered world of the medieval household, there were customs so deeply woven into the fabric of life that they seemed as ordinary as the morning light falling across a cold stone floor. But within that normalcy, there were rituals that now feel almost otherworldly, quietly strange, gently unsettling, and at times deeply human. Among these was the act of consummation, not in the privacy we might expect, but in a setting far more public, far more ritualized. The wedding bed, in certain corners of medieval life, was not always a private place. Sometimes it became a kind of performance, watched by curious eyes, commented upon in low murmurs, and accepted as a necessary part of a proper union. Picture a wedding day in a modest village, a kind where thatched roofs leaned close together and chickens wandered freely through open courtyards. The bride and groom, dressed in their best linen cleaned with care, borrowed ribbons, perhaps a necklace passed down for generations, had exchanged vows before the priest, the church bells ringing faintly through the trees. A feast had followed, with bread torn by hand and wine passed in wooden cups, laughter rising in gentle waves as dusk crept into the sky. And then came the final act, one whispered about during the feast, anticipated with a kind of collective breath-holding, the bedding. ceremony. In some homes, this was a quiet procession. In others, it was raucous and unkind, filled with teasing songs and drunken cheer. Either way, the result was the same. The newlyweds were led sometimes gently, sometimes playfully shoved toward the marriage bed. There they gathered witnesses, often family members and close neighbors, observed as the bride and groom were tucked beneath the blankets together. In some places, the guests would help undress them, peeling back layers of fabric with ceremonial solemnity or with body laughter, depending on the mood of the evening. The bed itself might be strewn with herbs, rosemary for fidelity, lavender for calm, and the room might be thick with the scent of old wood and oil lamps. And then they were left. Or sometimes they were not. There are stories well recorded in old letters and court documents of consummations watched closely by witnesses, nurses, clergy, noble women stationed in the room not out of voyeurism, but duty. Their presence was meant to ensure that the marriage had truly begun, that the union had been sealed in the flesh. For in a time when lineage meant everything, when land and name were passed down through blood, a marriage was not truly complete until it had been physically affirmed. A wedding without consummation was like a contract unsigned, an agreement left open-ended. Imagine the strangeness of it. The silence broken only by the crackle of the fire, the breath of the couple beneath, the covers, and the still presence of someone seated nearby, perhaps with her back turned politely, hands folded in her lap. Or worse, the memory of footsteps just beyond the door, ears pressed lightly against wood, waiting for a sign. Sometimes a token of bloodied cloth was brought out and shown to the waiting guests as proof. In noble houses, this was recorded and stored as though it were parchment bearing a royal seal. And for the couple at the center of it all, there was no escape. Whatever shyness or discomfort they felt was expected to be overcome, not for their own sake, but for the lineage they now represented. But even beyond the nobles and their need for heirs, such customs trickled down into common life. In small villages, it was common for neighbors to joke and prod, to sing songs with veiled meanings as the newlyweds approached the door of their chamber. In some traditions, guests would linger outside the room, drinking and laughing, pounding on the walls at intervals to make their presence known. Some believed it encouraged fertility. Others simply found joy in the shared moment, a kind of community initiation into marriage. It was loud and clumsy, tender and awkward, and for the bride and groom, it was a rite they had no choice but to endure. Not all such rituals were invasive. Some communities allowed for gentler expressions. A candle left burning outside the door. A bowl of milk placed by the bedside. Simple tokens that honored the moment without intruding upon it. These small gestures, quiet and symbolic, acknowledged that something deeply personal was happening, something worth marking with reverence. If not scrutiny. In rare cases, if a couple struggled to consummate the marriage, whether from fear, illness, or incompatibility, the consequences could be more than emotional. Families might intervene, priests might be summoned, and in some cases, the marriage might be annulled altogether. There were even public trials, strange and unsettling affairs, where a man might be asked to prove his potency before a panel of officials, sometimes in front of a physician, occasionally in the presence of his wife. These events were not merely private struggles, they became matters of law, of inheritance, of reputation. And the echoes of that night, the bedding night, would follow them for years. But beneath all the ceremony, all the watching eyes and whispered judgments, was something more delicate. There were the two individuals, often young, often uncertain, who were expected to cross the threshold from childhood to adulthood in a single evening. They were asked to be brave, to be ready, to fulfill roles they may not have understood. And in the privacy of that moment, however breached it may have been, they had to find one another, to learn the first notes of a song they would sing together or separately for the rest of their lives. Some found tenderness there, a soft hand, a gentle laugh, an awkward kindness that lingered like the smell of rosemary on the sheets. Others found only fear, confusion, silence. But whatever was felt, the bedding night left its mark. It was a doorway, a hinge in the timeline of their lives, forever remembered. Even if never spoken of again, in the centuries that followed, many of these customs faded. Privacy became more sacred, more expected. The marriage bed was reclaimed as a place for two alone. But the stories remain in dusty texts, in folktales, in quiet corners of history, where ritual and reality touched. They remind us of a time when love was less about feeling and more about function, yet still managed to carve out moments of warmth and trembling intimacy. A time when even the most private acts were wrapped in the fabric of community, of tradition, of belief, and when the candles burned low, and the songs outside the door turned to hums, and the fire crackled its last embers into the stone hearth, the world would grow still. 2 breaths in the dark, a slow settling of limbs, and the long night would begin, as it always had, with silence. Asterisk in the rhythm of medieval life, where every sound carried farther in the stillness of candlelight, and every movement was slower, more deliberate. There existed a quiet calendar of restraint, a set of invisible rules, not just for work and worship, but for love, especially for what happened behind closed doors, after dark, when the day's labor had ended, and 2 bodies might, in theory, draw near. This was a time of restriction as much as indulgence. The church, with its heavy hand and solemn voice, had mapped out the calendar, not only with feasts and fasts, but also with nights when love itself was forbidden. The body, it was believed, must be tamed. Even desire needed permission not. It was said that there were more days not to make love than there were days to do so. These were not merely suggestions whispered by clergy. They were decrees spoken from pulpits, written in books, copied by candlelight, echoed in confessionals where sins were weighed like stones on a scale. The rules were meticulous, and they followed the sacred cycles of the church year. One could not lie together on Sundays, nor on the eve of any holy day. Not during Lent, not during Advent, not on the days leading up to major feasts like Christmas or Easter, and certainly not on Fridays, for that was the day Christ had suffered, and to pursue pleasure on that day was unthinkable. The logic behind such restrictions was simple, at least in theory. Pleasure was dangerous. The body, left unchecked, could lead the soul astray. And so, to love rightly, one had to first learn to deny. Husbands and wives were taught that even within marriage, their union was not entirely theirs to govern. They were caretakers of their bodies, not owners. And like all things that belong to the divine, there were seasons of offering and seasons of withholding. Imagine the life of a couple who obeyed such rules. A man and a woman, bound together by marriage and duty, sleeping side by side on a straw-filled mattress in the corner of the stone cottage. Outside, the wind might howl softly through the trees. the branches tapping gently against the window. The fire burns low, casting long shadows across the floor. And in that stillness, perhaps one of them stirs. A hand moves beneath the covers, seeking warmth, seeking closeness. But then comes the memory today is a saint's day. Or the priest had mentioned in his sermon that this was a vigil night. So the hand stops, the moment passes. They lie still, side by side, hearts slowly settling back into rhythm. The rules, once again, hold firm. Over time, couples learned to count the days carefully. They lived not only by the seasons of harvest and frost, but by the sacred calendar pinned to the wall or etched into memory. Some even kept marked small lines on a piece of parchment or notches on a beam above the bed, reminders of which days were for restraint. It wasn't resentment that filled these silences. More often, it was resignation. A kind of reverence, perhaps. The belief that self-denial brought one closer to holiness, but the rules went deeper still. It wasn't just when you could lie together that mattered. It was how. The Church, through centuries of whispered doctrine and moral caution, taught that the only appropriate form of union was one that mirrored the perceived purity of nature. The man above, the woman below. No unnecessary exposure. No indulgence in pleasure for its own sake. The act was not meant to be an exchange of joy, but a duty, a sacred cooperation in the work of creation. To stray from that path, even within the bonds of marriage, was to risk sin. For some, these restrictions brought shame and confusion. For others, comfort and structure. And for many, it was simply the way things were. No one questioned whether it was right to wait or to follow these prescriptions. The rules were part of the air they breathed, the way the earth turned beneath their feet. They gave rhythm to something that might otherwise have felt chaotic. They brought order to the heart's chaos. And yet, not every night of restraint was filled with stillness. In some homes, the unspoken tension was palpable. A young wife, new to the rhythms of marriage, might lie awake wondering why her husband turned away. A husband, hands rough from farm work, might count the days with growing impatience, waiting for the morning when the church bells did not toll a warning. Desire unfulfilled did not always fade, it lingered, like the scent of bread left too long on the hearth, sweet and bitter all at once. But there were also nights when the rules offered a kind of relief, when the weariness of the body after a long day's toil made the idea of intimacy feel too heavy, too demanding. Then the sacred calendar came as a permission slip to rest, a reason not to reach, not to stir, to simply lie together, back, breathing in the silence, knowing that nothing more was expected. That in the quiet rhythm of denial, there was also peace. In the great halls of nobility, these rules were often bent or broken. Behind thick curtains and guarded doors, the calendar might be ignored, replaced by whim and indulgence. But among the common folk, where life was simpler, harder, and more bound to tradition, the rules held longer. They passed from parent to child, from priest to penitent, not as burdens, but as sacred truths. This is how we live. This is how we love. The irony, of course, was that these rules meant to suppress desire only made it stronger. What is withheld becomes precious. What is forbidden becomes imagined, dreamed about, longed for in the lonely hours before sleep. And so, through this strange system of denial, love found a new language. The waiting itself became a form of intimacy. The quiet glances, The small touches exchanged when nothing more was allowed held a tenderness that words could not reach. It was not the passion of the poets, not the fire of epic tales, but something smaller, quieter, and in many ways more enduring. The sacred breeding schedules, as some scholars later called them, were never written in stone. They shifted with regions, with customs, with changing tides of theology. But the memory of them lingers still, in the quiet rituals of long married couples, in the hush that falls over certain holy days, in the way even now love is shaped by time, by rhythm, by patience. And as the candle burned low in those ancient rooms, as the cold pressed gently against the shutters, and the soft breathing of two souls filled the silence, there was a kind of beauty in the waiting, a stillness that asked for nothing, offered nothing except presence, except the knowledge that tomorrow, perhaps, the calendar would allow what tonight it denied. That love, like the moon outside the window, would rise again, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. Asterisk, there was something deeply tender about the objects. People kept close to their skin in the old world things worn, not just for decoration, but for hope. In the Middle Ages, the world was full of hidden meanings and unseen forces. People carried charms and whispered prayers, not always loudly, but constantly, as though their lives depended on it. And sometimes they believed those charms could turn the wheel of love and longing. Among these quiet artifacts of desire was a curious item, worn snugly and secretly, close to the body. It was called the girdle of Venus, not a belt in the way we think of it now, but something more intimate. A strip of cloth or leather, sometimes tied with knots, sometimes embroidered with symbols, often infused with herbs, prayers, or hopeful superstition. It was said to awaken affection, to invite closeness, to remind the body of what it was capable of feeling. The belief in such girdles, these quiet little instruments of yearning, was not born from silliness, but from centuries of quiet observation. People noticed how certain objects, worn long enough and close enough, seemed to bring change. And so they sewed their hopes into fabric. The girdle of Venus wasn't necessarily scandalous. It was, in its own strange way, innocent. A wish tied with a knot, a whisper carried against the skin. Worn under clothing, it was known only to the wearer, perhaps to the person they longed for, and maybe to the old woman who stitched it by candlelight and said the right words while doing so. Sometimes the girdle was dipped in rose water or rubbed with crushed herbs, cinnamon, thyme, myrrh scents that warmed the skin and stirred the imagination. Other times it was adorned with little tokens, beads carved from bone, charm-shaped, like moons, tiny etched letters. These weren't merely decorative. Each one held meaning. Each one told a secret. If a woman wore such a girdle to bed, she might feel herself comforted by the closeness of her hopes, pressed softly against her. If a man wore one under his tunic during the day, he might believe it helped his courage, made his voice softer, his eyes kinder. People believed in the power of touch, but they also believed in the things that touched the body without hands. That a simple woven strand, tied at the hip or around the waist, could stir something inside. Not always lust, but readiness. The gentle return of feeling after too many seasons spent in quiet. After too much time spent alone or unnoticed. These girdles were not loud. They did not glow. They whispered instead. They said, "Remember that you are wanted, or might be. Remember that you were born to be close to someone else." The name, girdle, of Venus came much later, shaped by scholars and scribes who gave classical names to old folk things. But the idea is older than any single name. In village corners and under monastery eaves, people had long tied charms around their waists to mark moments of change, puberty, marriage, childbirth. These were turning points when the body needed guidance, protection, or awakening. A girdle was a friend through those shifts, a quiet witness, something worn during the softest hours of night, when dreams hovered like moths and everything inside the heart felt more possible. For women, the girdle was sometimes seen as a fertility aid, not in the harsh, clinical way that word now implies, but in a gentler, more mystical sense. It was believed to harmonize the body, to soften tension, to invite warmth. Midwives might recommend them, whispering that they helped make room for new life or simply eased the path toward conception. But beyond any practical goal, they were deeply personal. Worn beneath woolen gowns or linen shifts, they held secrets that not even the closest friends might know. Each knot tied with a private wish, each charm sewn in silence. Men wore them too, though less often spoken about. For them, the girdle might represent strength, but not the rough kind. It was a strength made of softness, emotional openness, gentleness in speech, the ability to listen and love without the need to dominate. These were not girdles of conquest. They were girdles of patience. They reminded the wearer to wait for the right moment, to let the rhythm of closeness arrive in its own time, rather than rushing toward it in heat or frustration. Some girdles were passed down, kept in drawers or tucked inside old wooden boxes, wrapped in cloth, scented with lavender, to keep away moths and time. They became heirlooms, not just for their material, but for the memories they carried. A mother might give one to her daughter on the eve of her wedding. A friend might offer one before a long journey. In these exchanges, there was no embarrassment, only understanding, only a shared acknowledgement that the heart sometimes needed help to open, and the body sometimes needed reminders that it was allowed to be loved. In certain folk tales, the girdle had magic. It could make someone fall in love with the wearer, or so it was said. But even in those stories, the magic never worked on command. The wearer had to believe, had to be still long enough to listen, had to carry the girdle with care and respect. If worn selfishly, the story said it might unravel on its own. Its knots would come loose, its charms would fall away like forgotten promises. Only those who carried their longing with grace were allowed to keep the magic alive, and perhaps that is why the girdle endured, not because it was powerful in any dramatic way, but because it was quiet, because it gave people something to hold on to in the long nights when loneliness felt like a second skin. It was a way to say, without speaking, that they still hoped for touch, still longed for warmth, still believed in the nearness of another heartbeat. The world moved more slowly then. People noticed things that now go unseen: the weight of cloth, the scent of oils warmed by skin, the soft tension of a knot tied too tightly. The girdle reminded them to be present, to breathe deeply, to carry their longing not as a burden, but as a companion. And in this gentle companionship, many found comfort. Not always fulfillment, but enough peace to rest their eyes. Enough hope to dream gently through the night. So the girdle of Venus lived on not in museums or glass cases, but in the quiet corners of memory, of longing, of the imagination. It rested where dreams are born, beneath blankets, beneath ribs, near the steady rhythm of the sleeping heart. Not loud, not dramatic, just a tender knot around the waist, saying quietly, "You are still capable of love. You are still worthy of warmth. You are still here." Asterisk, there were times in the old world when love and law became entangled in strange, uncomfortable ways, when the most private struggles of a marriage were lifted from behind closed doors and brought into the bright, cold light of public scrutiny. Among the more peculiar practices of medieval society were the trials, for impotence grim little performances, where couples were summoned not for crimes of violence or theft, but for what they had failed to do in the silence of the marital bed. These were not whispered arguments in the dark, not private moments of disappointment or heartache. They were loud, official, held in public rooms with stone floors and high ceilings, where magistrates sat with quills and records and waited to decide whether a marriage was real or whether it must be undone. That it often began with suspicion. A marriage that produced no child. A bride who whispered, red-faced, to a priest in confession that her husband had never touched her. Or a family that, eager for an heir, noticed that the new couple lived more like siblings than lovers. In a time when marriage was tied to land, inheritance, and duty, intimacy was more than personal. It was proof. And when proof was missing, questions followed. And so the couple was called forward, not with sympathy, but with stern curiosity. Man would be asked first. Was he capable? Had he tried? Had he made effort, as expected, to fulfill his role as husband? His answer would be measured. If he claimed yes, and the wife said no, the confusion deepened. If he admitted to difficulty, things moved quickly. Sometimes he was sent for examination, not by doctors as we know them today, but by clerics, by midwives, by appointed examiners, who would observe and report in uncomfortable detail whether the man's body behaved as it should. It was not medicine. It was spectacle, a way for society to look into the most private room in a house and say, "We have a right to know." There were cases where the accused man was asked to demonstrate his capabilities, not alone, but in front of officials, with a witness standing nearby, taking note of whether anything stirred. Sometimes they were asked to lie in bed with their wife while others waited outside, listening. The door might remain ajar, the sheets later inspected. In the worst cases, a woman might be asked to testify under oath, describing what did or did not happen in the night. Her words weighed carefully, sometimes more so than his. If she blushed too deeply, looked away too quickly, some believed she was lying. If she spoke too plainly, too calmly, they accused her of cruelty. And through it all, the man stood quietly, hands clasped in front of him, head bowed, not because he was guilty of anything, but because shame wrapped itself around the room like cold air. Impotence was not just a physical concern. It was a wound to pride, to masculinity, to the very idea of what it meant to be a man. In a world where men worked with their hands, fought with swords, made decisions with certainty, the inability to perform this most intimate task was seen as failure, not just in private, but in the eyes of the community. But what the community often forgot was that these moments were not only about performance, they were also about fear, about wounds unseen. There were men who trembled not because they could not love, but because they had never been taught how. Because they were afraid of closeness, of being known in their weakness. Because they had learned from boyhood that love was duty, and duty did not include tenderness. And so they froze. They turned away. They wept, sometimes in the darkness. Alone, the women, too, suffered in silence. Some of them were young, barely more than girls, thrust into marriage with men they barely knew. Others had hoped for warmth, and instead received absence. They did not always speak out of cruelty. Some did so out of desperation, out of a longing to be seen, to be held, to be touched in the way they had been promised when the vows were spoken. And so they stood in courtrooms, trembling, voices low, telling strangers about nights spent lying still, waiting for something that never came. There were times when such trials ended in annulment, the marriage declared invalid, the husband labeled impotent in the records, his future uncertain. Other times, the court ordered another attempt, another night, another test, as though love could be summoned by decree, as though desire could be scheduled and judged. These were not resolutions, they were delays. And behind them, lives paused too. People caught in the space between failure and freedom, not quite together, not quite apart. There were rare cases too, when the accused man was not impotent in general, but claimed to be so only with his wife. This strange exception gave rise to another uncomfortable solution, trial by copulation. In these instances, the man might be asked to prove himself with another woman, often a midwife or a volunteer appointed by the court. The logic was cruel, but simple. If he could perform elsewhere, the fault lay not with him, but with the match. If he failed again, then perhaps it was nature. These trials blurred the line between justice and violation. They were never fair. They were never kind. But amid all the coldness, the process sometimes revealed truths not easily spoken. That marriage was hard. That intimacy could not be forced. That bodies, no matter how strong, did not always respond on command. And that love, in its truest form, could not be measured by function alone. When these trials ended, when the witnesses left and the scribes folded their notes, what remained was not resolution, but silence. Two people, now marked by the process, returned to their homes, sometimes separately, sometimes together, trying again. They did not speak of it. They did not want to. The words had already been said too many times, to too many ears. And still, the nights went on. Fires were lit. Beds were made. The wind moved softly through thatched roofs. And in the quiet, beneath blankets, hearts continued to beat wounded. Uncertain, but still beating. For even in the coldest trials, even in the cruelest judgments, people longed for something simple, to be close, to be accepted, to be held not for what they could prove, but for who they were when no one else was watching. From ritualized communal beds to church-mandated breeding routines, medieval sexuality was a strange dance between desire, religion, and law. It reveals how societies struggle with the same paradox we do today, regulating intimacy while craving it. These bizarre practices force us to rethink our assumptions and remind us that human nature has always been inventive, awkward, and occasionally shocking.